You ready? Well, good evening. Good evening. Appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the ones that are online watching. I especially want to begin with, and I'll say this again on Sunday, I'm thankful that Justin is here so I can tell you how much I appreciate you filling in. I wish I could say the same for the Sunday morning guy, but hopefully the eldership's going to be meeting with him before long, and we don't take kindly to false doctrine around here, so anyway, he said, I wondered if you'd find out about that, and I said, Gordon sent me a picture before services were done, so, anyway, it was funny. We are in John chapter 13, and we are in verse 21 of John chapter 13, and that's where we're going to pick up. And for those of you that maybe weren't able to be with us last week, just a reminder of kind of where we're at. This is that upper room dialogue that takes place between, we're going to begin with Jesus and the 12, and then we're going to move on when we get to chapter 14 to Jesus and the 11. And this is, we talked about last week, this is a conversation between Jesus and these disciples, and really the majority of what he's going to talk about in this upper room dialogue are a lot of the things that we're going to read John write about in his first epistle, in 1 John. And, the things that we're talking about in these few chapters, all of it doesn't apply to us. Some of it applies to us because 1 John tells us that, but this is a conversation between Jesus and the disciples, and we got to remember that as we go into it, but we'll even see a little bit of that as we go into some of what we're going to talk about this evening. But we start off when they first get there, and we talked about this also last week, by the way, that John spends more time on what happens in this upper room than any of the other gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mostly focus on the fact that while they're up there participating in this Passover feast together, that's when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And the one thing that John really doesn't cover is the fact that in the upper room Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. But this was a gospel that was written quite a bit of time later, and it seems to be, for a big portion of it at least, of the entire gospel, that John is writing some stuff that maybe the church had asked him to, give us some more information about Jesus. And a lot of what John records is not things that are mentioned in the other three accounts. So verse 21 begins with, after saying these things, and these things, of course, are the conversation that he had with them about, his washing their feet, and it was all about his serving to them, and how that this was a lesson that he wanted them to understand, was that if they were going to be followers of him, they are, and he's going to talk about later in this upper room discussion about the fact that as the apostles, they're going to be sent out with this message and this mission and this work that they're supposed to do, and they're going to become leaders in the church. And the tendency would be that when you're someone in a position of authority or leadership, sometimes it can be that you begin to think too highly of yourself or over-evaluate your importance or whatever. And I'm wanting you to understand, Jesus says, that the kind of leadership that my kingdom needs is servant leadership. And that's what Jesus has been trying to explain to them. And then after saying those things, it says in verse 21 that Jesus was troubled in his spirit. Now, the last time that Jesus was troubled in his spirit was in chapter 11 and verse 33, when he was there at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus is troubled in his spirit, and what's going to happen? If you saw the social media post that I put out there, tonight's lesson, betrayal and love were the first two words in the title, and it sounds almost like a daytime soap opera or something. But betrayal is what we're going to talk about. In the beginning of this text, the rest of this chapter we're going to talk about this evening, a lot of it focuses on the fact that Judas is going to betray Jesus. And that betrayal is why Jesus is so troubled at this point. Now, there's other things, obviously, on Jesus' mind. We're going to see later on him go to the garden and he's upset about the fact that he knows what he's going to have to face, and he doesn't want to face that, and none of us would. But here, the troubling part is what his friend is about to do to him, that Judas is about to betray him. And Jesus is going to make it clear that he knew what was going on. In fact, if you remember back in chapter 7, after you had chapter 7 and 8, after you had that big discussion at the Feast of Booths about who Jesus was, a lot of the people after they went through all of that, a lot of the people heard what Jesus said, and a lot of people went home. You remember that? And Jesus looked at the disciples and he said, "Will you go away also?" And Peter was the one that said, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And Jesus said, "Did I not chose you, and yet one of you is going to betray me?" Jesus knew all along that this was going to happen. But knowing it was going to happen didn't minimize how much it was going to hurt him when it happened. I don't know if you've ever been betrayed by a friend or someone you thought that you could trust, but it's hurtful. Especially someone that you've worked with and side by side you've experienced so many things. We'll talk more about Judas as we go on through this, but someone that he had spent so much time with and worked with and studied with and all of those things, and here he is at this moment that he knows what he's about to do. He's about to go out and betray him, and Jesus is troubled. And again, the last time that we saw this word used about how troubled he was back in chapter 11 when he's at his friend Lazarus' tomb, and which was also his friend who had died. And if you're betrayed, it kind of feels like that person, that friendship at least, has died. Yeah. Well, and the first part is, yeah, and the first part you said, I think, is especially true. If you didn't hear Charles, she was talking about how that this is showing the human side of Jesus, and he probably still had the hope. Judas didn't have to do this, and God's will was going to be accomplished no matter what. One of the things that we sometimes are guilty of is acting like that God needs us to do wrong, at different accounts in the Bible. But God didn't need that or want that, certainly. But I really do think that first part is especially true. One of the really interesting studies in the Gospels is to go through all of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and notice all of the times in which Jesus has shown his human side. When it talks about how that he was tempted in all points like we are, well, that's true from a sin and righteousness kind of level, but even beyond that, the number of times it talks about Jesus being hungry, or Jesus being thirsty, or Jesus being tired, or Jesus being troubled or upset. And it's a different word in the original language, but in chapter 14, the conversation is going to shift to how the disciples were troubled. And he says, "Let not your heart be troubled." He knows what all is happening, and he knows why that it's happening. And one of the reasons why he's going to do the things that he's doing is he wants the disciples later on to be able to look back and say, "Oh, that didn't catch him by surprise." And there's a verse in particular we're especially going to point that part out. But still, it hurts Jesus. We think about sometimes, and we talk about, and rightfully so, the physical pain that Jesus endured, in the scourging and on the cross and those kinds of things. But I don't know that we spend enough time talking about the emotional pain that Jesus felt. And that was real. And if you've ever gone through something traumatic, I don't know that I wouldn't rather have physical pain than emotional pain.
I think we'll come across that a little bit later on, the emotion, the trauma that he goes through, the total human side of him that we can see, the man side of him, and how he's troubled with it, and knowing what he's going to have to suffer once he's arrested or taken away by the soldiers.
Yeah. So that's I just think it's important to notice here that what's fixing to happen, this is not something Jesus was happy about, that Jesus wanted to happen, that Jesus was excited about at all. Quite the opposite. He was very troubled in his spirit. And so this is what he says, and here's another one of those truly, truly, or amen, amen statements that John records for us. Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. He just says it flat out. Now, they're still not going to understand, and they're not really sure who it is. Again, when we look back from the perspective of, having all of the Bible written and being able to look backwards in history, it's almost like, I don't know if you watch movies or TV shows or whatever, and sometimes within like 5 minutes, that's the bad guy. I guess the old silent movie, whenever I was in junior high, I don't know, it's funny, don't tell Craig Rogers I said this. I don't remember what he taught me about history with all this, but I remember doing this project. We made a silent movie. He was my 8th grade history teacher, had him for American history, and we made a silent movie. And you'll not believe this, but he cast me as the bad guy. I don't know why. But anyway, had a black suit on and a black top hat, and I had a curly mustache that I was constantly doing this with, and we went down to where like Gingerbread Junction was, where the old railroad tracks were, and I don't even remember who the heroine was, but I literally tied her to the railroad tracks, and anyway, it was traumatic for me because, being typecast that way. But anyway, those kind of movies, you could tell who the bad guy was because they looked like a bad guy, right? Well, that's the way we kind of view Judas, is that he's the bad guy. But no one else saw Judas as the bad guy. In fact, the other gospel accounts will talk about how that when Jesus says that one of y'all is going to betray me, none of them say, I bet it's Judas. Now, John earlier, you recall, he tells us, because John's looking back and he can't help himself, but Judas kept the money bag because he was a thief. He wants you to know that we know now what kind of guy that he was. But at this time, they didn't know that. They're asking, is it me? They didn't ask, is it Judas? They said, is it me? Because they really didn't know. They never guessed that it was Judas. In fact, they had more of an opinion that it was themselves. And even when what happens, they still don't think that Judas is the one going to betray him. We'll see when we get on in here. So he says, the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at Jesus' side. Now, this is the first reference to John in his own gospel. First time he's ever mentioned, and we talked about it in the introductory material a long time ago when we started John, how that John never refers to himself by name. It's always the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the one who was leaning on his breast at supper, or some of those kind of terms that he'll use. But this is the first time that he's ever really referenced himself. It could be that, remember in John chapter 1, when after John the Baptist baptized Jesus, it said that the next day, 2 of John's disciples were standing there. One of them, Andrew, was one of them. He didn't tell us who the other one was, and that's when John the Baptist saw Jesus walk by and said, "Behold the Lamb of God," and they began to follow him. And there's speculation that maybe that was John, and that's why he didn't tell us who that disciple was, but maybe it was some other one that we wouldn't have known anyway. But this is the first reference to John in his own gospel. But notice again, verse 22 said that they were uncertain of whom he spoke. And he says that the disciples were reclining at the table and at Jesus' side. So again, remember the way that like a Middle Eastern ancient dining feast kind of situation would have been. It would have been a low to the ground table with pillows all around it, and they would have been reclining. Usually they would recline on their left arm with like their top half towards the table and their feet kind of laying away from the table. And position was always really an important place. You remember when John and James's mother came to Jesus and is asking if her sons could sit on his left and right hand when he came into his kingdom. Because it's kind of like that way today. You know, if you ever get invited to a wedding and there's a reception and there's seating assignments, you kind of get an idea of how much the bride and groom thinks of you is how close to the head table you are, you know. Well, in that environment, it was, you know, you wanted to be on the left and the right hand of the king. And the closer you got to sit to the king showed how important that you were. And notice here that it says that that's where John is. He's leaning back against Jesus. So, you know, Jesus is here. That would have meant that John was right here. And to talk to him, he would have kind of leaned back towards him. And that's what's going on. He's right at his side. But I want you to notice who's probably on Jesus' other side when this happens. Because Peter motioned to him, to John, and he asked him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. I want you to ask him. Now, it's interesting that Peter tells John to do this because usually Peter's the outspoken one, isn't he? He's usually the one that will say, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's build 3 tabernacles, one for you and Moses and one for Elijah. Or he's the one that would say, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Or he's the one that would say, you know, when Jesus said, I've got to go to Jerusalem and be arrested and be punished and put to death. No, that's not going to happen to you. He was the outspoken one. And even in our context, he's fixing to be outspoken again. But this is the one time he's not. He asks John to ask him. And maybe it was because, again, they didn't know who it was. Maybe it's me, and I really want to get that kind of news, you know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, for some reason I just thought of this. Maybe the disciples, the apostles were thinking, you know, I hope I have done everything he has taught me. I hope I haven't done anything wrong, you know. They might have suspected, you know, what have I done? You know, is it me? What have I done? You know, I've done everything I think I should have and supposed to. And
well, all of them have done. Like you think about with Judas, even when Jesus sends out the apostles, the disciples, on the limited commission, and they're teaching and they're healing people and performing miracles. Well, Peter did that, and John did that, and James did that, and Judas did that. So they all thought of each other that they were. In fact, if they had to, I don't know that Judas would have been the first guy they would suspected, because John now, as he's writing nearly a century later, says, hey, that was the guy that was a thief. But at the time, they all trusted him enough to carry the money bag. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread that I have dipped it. And so Jesus says, this is how I'm going to show you who it is. I'm going to dip this morsel of bread and I'm going to give it to somebody. So again, they're at the Passover feast. They would have had a roasted lamb that they would have been partaking of. And here's this bowl of lamb gravy. And he's going to take a piece of bread, and I'm putting in Tennessee terms now. He's going to sop up a little gravy on that piece of bread. And whoever I get it is the guy that's going to betray me. And when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So this is why I say that John is on one side of Jesus. I think it's very likely that Judas was on the other side of Jesus, because he didn't say, here, pass this down to Judas. You know, he handed it to him. And so again, the position that Judas held among the disciples was one, no one thought that he would have been the one to have betrayed Jesus. He dipped the morsel and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And after he'd taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said, what you're doing, do quickly. You remember back up earlier in the chapter in verse 2 that it said Satan had already put on his heart what it was that he was going to do. We talked about how that Satan makes suggestions to us. That's the way that he did with Adam and Eve. That's the way that he did with Jesus. When he tempts, he makes suggestions. But Satan only has whatever power over us that we allow him to have. And it seems it's this moment that Judas just gives in to what it is that Satan had been suggesting that he does, and he allowed him to take up ownership of his heart. So Jesus says to him, what you're doing, do quickly. He commands him, what you're going to do, go do it and take care of it. And it's, I think Jesus is wanting, again, they didn't realize what was going on at the time. They don't think Judas is going to betray him. Jesus is wanting everybody to see what's happening to me is not happening to me because I couldn't accomplish what I was wanting to accomplish. This didn't take me by surprise, okay? I've been in control. He talked about earlier, and he's going to use this phrase in a minute. He talked about earlier about how that the good shepherd gives up his life. No one takes it from me, but I give it up on my own. I'm giving it up on my own, and he's showing that by saying, commanding, you go do it. I'm in control of this whole situation. And that commanding him to do that is part of this.
This conversation is taking place. John asked him who it is. Jesus answered. Is that a private conversation between just the two of them, or is it? He said, I don't know that everybody.
That we don't know, because we also don't know how many. We always, like you see the paintings and whatnot, and it's Jesus and the 12 that's at the table. But we know that there were other followers of Jesus, other men, other women. There would have been probably servants that would have been up there serving the meal to them and that type of thing. So we don't know how much is in there. It's kind of like, whenever you go to, there's restaurants that Melody and I, we may like the food there, we may get it to go, but we don't go there because you can't hear each other talk when you go. That's so loud. And sometimes with a big crowd of people, maybe all of them didn't hear it. We just don't know.
The reason I'm asking, he says, should I give a morsel of bread to him? And then he hands it to Judas. Well, you would think Judas wouldn't take it if he said it out loud.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking maybe I'm going to show you this.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you didn't hear, he's saying that maybe Judas didn't hear it. Otherwise, why? If you're Judas and you heard Jesus say, whoever I give this piece of bread to, that's him. If you're Judas, maybe you're saying, no, I don't want any more. I'm good. I'm full. I don't need any seconds. I don't believe in sopping up gravy. I'm on a keto diet right now, Jesus. I don't need any carbs. So, but he didn't. And so maybe that was just between Jesus and John. But anyway, Jesus is in control of this whole situation, and he wants that. And it says in verse 28, now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or he that should give something, or that he should give something to the poor. So they didn't know why Jesus said, what you're doing, go quickly, which may be to your point that the rest of them didn't hear the conversation between Jesus and John. But the last thing any of them thought about Judas was that he was going out to betray him. Again, the other gospel accounts tell us that when Jesus says, one of you going to betray me, they all start saying, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? And then they see Judas get up and go out of the room, and their first thought isn't, well, I wonder if that's who he was talking about. It was, I bet he's going to buy some supplies. That Judas, he's a good old boy, They thought just the best of Judas. And so maybe he was going to do some good deed for Jesus. And then in verse 30, he says, so after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. And this section, if I can zoom up here a little bit. Ooh, too far over. This little section, I've got some verses there that you may want to examine. The idea that he's at night. Remember we talked about throughout John how there's all these different occasions in which there is light with a big L and light with a little l, and there's water with a big W and water with a little w. Jesus is at a well, Jacob's well, and there's a woman who came with a bucket to get water with a little w. And while she's there, Jesus says, I am the living water with a big W. I gave the illustration of Coke, and how in the South we say you want a Coke with a little c, and then you can say, yes, well, what kind? You can say Coke with a big C, or Mountain Dew, or Pepsi, or whatever it is. And then Michael sent me a a picture of, I don't know if that was uptown during the soybean festival. I guess this big giant inflatable Coca-Cola that was about 15 foot tall, Coke bottle, and he says, "Is this a Coke with a big C or a little C?" I said, "That's a Coke with a big C, a big O, a big K, a big E, you know." Well, it's just interesting that he throws in this little phrase here that it was night. Because if you go outside at nighttime, what are you walking into? Darkness. He's sitting there with the light. In the light, the little L, but he's sitting there with the light of the world, with a big L. And all of these passages, chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, chapter 8, verse 12, chapter 9, verse 5, 11, 9 and 10, and then chapter 12, verses 35 through 36, all of those passages are passages that repeatedly in John, he's talked about how that Jesus is the light of the world. In fact, you can go all the way back to chapter 1, and he talked about how that the Word was the light of the world, and that he came into the world to give light to the world. Judas is literally sitting there with literally the light, big L, of the world, and he decides, I'm going to go out into darkness. And it's important for us to realize that we're all making that same decision as well. That it's not enough just to sit with Jesus. What are we doing? Are we going out into the darkness without Him? Let's see if I can get that back down. This doesn't control it as well as I would like for it to. It's jumping on me. There it goes. All right. Verse 31. Now Jesus is going to talk about love. It says that when he had gone out, Judas had gone out. Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in Him." And this idea of Jesus being glorified and God being glorified, and in verse 32, he's going to use that word again, he glorified in Him, also glorified Him, glorify Him. This idea that he's saying, he first of all says, "But now," and how many times in this gospel have all the way back to like chapter 2, remember when he's at the wedding feast at Cana and his mother comes to him and says, "They've run out of wine," and he says, "What's that to me? My time is not yet come." Well, now is the time. And over, and especially in chapter 12 and 13, he's talking about how that the Passover was at hand, the time was at hand. And now he says it's the time for the Son of Man, which is Jesus' favorite term for Himself, the Son of Man to be glorified, and God the Father is going to be glorified in Him and the things that He's doing, and that's, of course, going to happen in this greatest of all the signs. We talked about last week how that chapters 1 through 12 is sometimes called the book of signs, because there's all of these different signs that Jesus did that it's talking about there. And then after we get through with this upper room dialogue, the greatest of all the signs, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, is going to take place, which will prove who He is. He says, if God is glorified in Him, God will also glorify Him in Himself and glorify Him at once. That's the reason that this is happening. The disciples are going to look at this as if this is the end, as if it's over. And part of what he's now starting this process of ministering to them. We usually think about chapter 14 of where Jesus is really starting to minister to the disciples. But Jesus is really starting here, focusing on now the 11 that's there. Judas has left the room. Focusing on the 11, ministering to them, getting them ready for the fact that He's going to die. Now, I think it's important for us to realize that Jesus is ministering to the disciples through all of this, and yet the very first verse that we studied tonight said, what's Jesus' condition? Remember? He was troubled in spirit. He's down. And that you would look at it and say, Jesus needs to be ministered to. But Jesus, even when He's down, is ministering to others. Because that's what Jesus does. He says, "Little children, yet a little while am I with you. You will seek me, and just as I told to the Jews, or said to the Jews, so now I also say to you that where I am going, you cannot come." Now, it's interesting that he'd already told back in chapter 7 and chapter 8, in that discussion with the Jewish leaders, one of the things that he talked about was the fact that he was going away, and where I'm going, you can't come. Remember, they said, well, he's going to the Gentiles. That's where he's going. And they had it all. And he said, you can't come. You can't go where I'm going. And Jesus said, remember, I had this conversation with the Jewish leaders, and I told them that I'm going. And where I'm going, they can't, just like I told them they can't come, you can't come. Where I'm going, you can't come. He says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. We'll come back, by the way, to the where I'm going, you can come. He says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I've loved you, you're also to love one another. By this all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love one for another. Well, if you look over in 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 and 18, he's going to tell us the same thing, that Jesus loved us, and He showed His love by what He's done. He died for us. It's a really interesting study to go through and just talk about all of the things that Jesus did to show His love for us. Because love, and we've talked about this before, but love is a doing. It's not just an emotion. It's easy to say, I love someone, but do you show it by the way? Remember what he started all this discussion with in chapter 13 was serving the disciples, washing their feet, right? It's about doing. It's about action. And that's what he's saying. He says, just like I love you, I want you to love each other like I have loved you. And it applies to us, not because he says it here, but because John writes it to the church in 1 John 3, 16 and 18. But he says, this is the way people are going to know that you're my followers, is if you love like I do. Now, doesn't that make sense? I've told you, I don't know how many times I've told you that all my life, I've heard two things a bunch. That you look just like Mike Sawyers. Or, closely related to that one, you act just like Mike Sawyers. Well, guess what? We're kin, you know. So, of course I'm going to look like him, and of course I'm going to act like him. I even had, I don't remember, it was one of y'all, I don't remember who it was, but somebody here recently here at church said, I saw a picture of your brother, and he looked just like your daddy. And I thought, well, we've never heard that one before, have we? But anyway, he ought to look a little like him. He's his son too, you know. And not his favorite, but he's still, no, I'm just kidding. Bradley actually looks more like the Cooper side, my papa. Now, I didn't get told I look like my papa, but I heard all my life, you act like Richard Cooper. Papa used to say that from here up I might look like a Sawyers, but from here down I look more like the Coopers. I don't know, but my brother didn't get that part of the Coopers. He got the face part, but Bradley's skinny. So, but my brother and I act like and look like our parents and our grandparents because they're our parents and grandparents. My boys now have heard, you look just like your daddy, or you act just like your daddy, or whatever it might be. If God is our Father, if we are followers of Jesus, then we ought to act like Him. We ought to love like Him. That's serving. That's what He did in this chapter, is serving. It means getting dirty sometimes and helping others. It means caring enough about each other to put their needs above our own. That's what Jesus is going to do when He dies. He says, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, he tells us that we have to love each other. In fact, there's so much that, remember, John is one of the sons of thunder. He and his brother, when the Samaritans are not accepting Jesus, he says, well, let's just call down thunder from the sky and destroy them all. Why don't you do that, Lord? And John is known as the apostle of love, not because that was just naturally who he was, but because he's been changed by Jesus, see. And that's the lesson that he's wanting us to understand as well. And then, beginning in verse 36, the conversation shifts towards Simon Peter. Now, before we get down to there, he said, where I'm going, you cannot come. Later on, Jesus is going to tell the disciples that you can't come now. He told them in John chapter 7 and 8, he told those religious leaders that were rejecting him, He said, where I'm going, you can't come, because they didn't believe in Him. But Jesus tells the disciples, where I'm going, you cannot come now. And He's going to repeatedly, throughout this chapter, through this discussion, these next few chapters, He's going to talk about that we're going to be together, but where I'm going right now, you just can't come right now. And part of the reason why is because where He's going now, He was talking about, I'm going to be with the Father earlier, and if you're not going to believe me, you can't have life eternal, right? You can't go be with the Father. But where He's going now is to give His life in submission to the Lord. And the disciples think that they're ready for that, don't they? They think, man, if it meant giving my life for Jesus, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But are they really ready for that? No. They show they're not, right? And so they think they're ready, but Jesus says you're not ready for that yet. And it's a good thing, really, that they weren't. Because if they had tried, Peter, when they come to arrest Jesus in the garden, Peter's going to draw a sword, and he's a fisherman, not a swordsman, so he's a bad aim, and he cuts somebody's ear off. Probably trying to cut his head off, but he ends up just cutting his ear off. And if this collection of 11 guys some were fishermen and some were tax collectors and different things, if they had said, all right, the 11 of us against the Roman army, let's go, what would have been the results? Disastrous. They'd all probably ended up on a hill with Jesus on a cross, if not had been put to death sooner in the fracas. So the fact that they ran off allowed their faith to grow and build, and they were around then to do the mission that Jesus has for them. So, verse 36, Simon Peter said to Him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I'm going, you cannot follow now. See, you cannot follow me now. Again, go back up to verse 33. He's not telling them you can't follow permanently, just now you can't. But you will follow afterwards. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? You're not ready yet, Peter. Now, by the way, this idea of follow, it's not a key word in the book of John, but it's an important idea. The book starts in chapter 1 talking about this idea of following, and in chapter 6, and it's going to end with the idea of following. Remember, Jesus and Peter has that discussion when they're walking on the seashore about Jesus saying, if you love me, then follow me, and feed my sheep, and tend my sheep, and those kinds of things. It's an interesting study about following throughout this book. But you can't go, but later on you'll be able to follow me. Now, again, Jesus is saying you can't follow me to the point of giving your life for the kingdom's sake. Peter says, why can't we? And notice what he says, I will lay down my life for you. I am ready to follow you to death. But again, was Peter ready? Not really, but he thinks he is. And so Jesus says, will you lay your life down for me? That had to have been a cutting question. Have you ever told somebody, I'd do anything for you, and they say, will you? I love you, really? You wouldn't want your wife to respond that way, would you? I love you, really? I couldn't tell lately. Well, I will lay down my life. Will you lay down your life for me? Because Jesus says, truly, truly, here's another amen, amen statement. Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Now, what's ironic about all of this is Peter says, I'm ready. Can we not follow you? Because I'm ready to follow you. And Jesus tells him he's not. He's going to deny him 3 times before the cock crows, and he will. But what's ironic is that ultimately Peter will die for the cause of Christ. The Scriptures don't record that for us, but Jesus is going to imply that a little bit at the end of this book. But history tells us that all but John died for the cause of Christ. So they will follow him, but they're not ready to right now. They're not at that point yet. And it certainly must have been a hard thing for people. Everything about this conversation is hard, but it still had to be had. That's why the next chapter is going to start off, let not your heart be troubled. Because they're all upset. The fact that somebody's going to betray me upset them. The fact that Jesus is troubled, you can tell that, can't you? When somebody you love is upset, that would be upsetting. The fact that Jesus is going away and they can't come, that He's in essence telling them, you're not really ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for me like you think you are. All of that would have been troubling. But it's a conversation that they had to have, in part because Jesus is going to try to encourage them and get them ready for what's coming, so that it's going to all catch them by surprise, but He wants them on the backside of this to be able to look back and say, Jesus wasn't blindsided by any of this. Jesus was in control of all of this all along. But He wants them to understand that this is part of God's plan. And you've got a big part to play in that plan. It may not be what you want or the way you want, but it's an important part that you play. And so I think it's interesting to think about the three people that we've really kind of discussed in this section of Judas and John and Peter, and try to put ourselves in their place. In Judas's place, where would you be seated? Would you want to be seated next to Jesus? Would you be considered that important to Him? And think about everything that Judas had heard. He'd basically been in the Jesus school of preaching. All the things that he'd heard Jesus teach, and he didn't see all of Jesus' miracles. He saw a bunch of Jesus' miracles. All of the things that he witnessed, all of the things that he heard. And yet he still goes out to do what he wants. Are we letting what we're seeing and being taught get into our heart? Or are we still listening to ourselves and to Satan and what we want? Or put ourselves in John's shoes. That special relationship that he had. He was one of that inner three of James and John and Peter that got to see all of the things that Jesus did and go and be places that the others didn't get to. Would you pay attention enough that you would let yourself be changed from the son of thunder to the apostle of love? See? Or put yourself in the shoes of Peter. That impetuous, outspoken nature that he had. And, a lot of times we're drawn to people like that as leaders, but sometimes those are the ones that are leading us down the wrong road sometimes. What would we claim that we would do? I heard a lady in Bible class one time that she said, well, if I saw the things that they saw, there's no way that I wouldn't believe. Well, look at how many people saw and didn't believe. We can make some bold claims, and it's easy. It really is easy for us to sit in a room like this and talk about, this is what I would do if I was persecuted. Or I've had you have these conversations in ministry. I'm not wanting anybody to feel sorry for me at all, but I've had conversations recently with people that I can go to Denver to a lectureship, and I can preach in black and white. Here's what the Bible says. There's no doubt about it. But when you're dealing with people that you know and love, it's hard. It's difficult. That's when it's challenging. It's easy to talk about what the Bible says, but when you get it into real life, what do we do with it? You see what I'm saying? Are we going to be the bold ones to say, well, I would never turn away from him, because we do that sometimes by, well, I can flirt with that secretary and I can stop anytime I want and it's not that big a deal. Or I can go to that place and where everybody's doing all those things that they shouldn't do. Or I can get drunk, or I can use this, or I can do what, and it's not going to have an impact. I can stop at any time, or I can do what. It's not going to have an effect on me. And we wind up turning away from Jesus in the process. Love is an action, and it's got to be shown to each other, but it's got to be shown to the Lord by the decisions we make. So next week we won't be in here for class, but when we come back in a couple of weeks, we will pick up with chapter 14, and one of the, maybe outside of John 3:16, the most familiar few verses in the Gospel of John is what we're going to look at in these first 6 verses in chapter 14 and continue with our conversation there. While Tucker's getting everything turned off online, we appreciate everybody that's online watching. Hope you'll share whatever your platform on that you're watching this, and hope you'll be with us in person as soon as you can. For those of you that are here, we have a few announcements that we want to make you aware of.